From the National Museum of the United States Air Force in Dayton, Ohio, this is the XB-70 Valkyrie, the most advanced bomber of its time, built to fly 3 times the speed of sound. It was cutting-edge technology, but as President Eisenhower put it, bows and arrows in a time of gunpowder. This wasn't just a cutting-edge bomber, it became ammunition in the 1960 presidential election. Eisenhower scaled it back. Kennedy criticized Republicans' defense cuts using this plane as an example, but then himself canceled the program upon taking office. In the end, only 2 were built at a staggering cost of over $13 billion in today's dollars. One was destroyed in a fiery midair collision. Today, this is the last XB-70 on Earth. Let's dive into its incredible story. So this all started out during the Cold War when the Air Force sent out a request for a Mach 3 bomber. This was meant to replace the B-52, delivering nuclear weapons at speeds and altitudes that would make interception impossible. So if you think about it, as futuristic as this aircraft still looks today, its design began the same year as the 1955 Chevrolet debuted, and just 1 year before Elvis Presley made his historic first appearance on The Ed Sullivan Show. So imagine how futuristic this must have seemed at the time. Going back to 1955, the B-52 Stratofortress was the backbone of the Air Force's bomber fleet. The goal was to develop a bomber, though, that would be virtually invulnerable to enemy defenses. Even the B-52, as capable as it was, would eventually become vulnerable. It's ironic, really, because not only is the B-52 flying still today, it's actually expected to serve into the 2050s, maybe even the 2060s. So we could potentially have 100-year-old airframes by the time these planes are retired. But that aside, back in the late 1950s, the Air Force believed that the future of nuclear bombers meant flying higher and faster than anything in the sky. The Air Force invited several aerospace companies to submit designs for its next-generation bomber, among which were Boeing and North American Aviation. In late 1955, both were awarded Phase 1 development contracts, which involved detailed design reports, wind tunnel testing, and mock-ups of their respective proposals. Both companies faced significant technological challenges in meeting the Air Force's rigorous requirements. The aircraft needed to fly at 75,000 feet, have a range of 10,500 miles, and reach Mach 3. Both designs ultimately featured the delta wing configurations, but they differed in engine layout and other technical details. After 2 years of evaluation, in late 1957, the Air Force awarded the full-scale development contract to North American, launching the design and construction of what would become the XB-70. This was an incredibly complex project, a massive aircraft designed to fly 3 times the speed of sound. At those speeds, heat would become a major challenge. The entire aircraft and its engines will expand as they heat up, and that requires an immense amount of engineering and precision to accommodate. One of the biggest issues was material selection. A plane this large, flying at Mach 3, would generate so much heat that aluminum simply wasn't durable enough. Engineers had to come up with a completely new approach. So they came up with a stainless steel honeycomb structure, never before attempted, offering heat resistance while keeping the aircraft light enough for Mach 3. That still makes up about 2/3 of this aircraft's weight. Titanium was also essential. About 9% of the aircraft's structure was made from titanium, and they used that in key areas that had to withstand the extreme temperatures. So here at the museum, they have this really cool interactive screen here, and you can click on various points of the aircraft and it will explain more about it. Movable ramp in front of the cockpit could be raised to reduce drag at high speed. The display here shows the ramp lowered. Hit more, and it comes up here. Valkyrie pilots typically only raise this ramp at the highest speeds since it greatly reduced their forward vision, and you can see here how it would come up. This talks about its landing gear. The XB-70's tires contained a silver-colored heat-resistant material to withstand temperatures as high as 360 degrees. Its complex landing gear malfunctioned in 1 in 10 flights. The XB-70's complex landing gear could fold into a small area and used special heat-resistant tires and anti-lock brakes. The canards added stability and augmented the elevons for pitch, nose-up, nose-down control, hinged flaps on the canards deployed on takeoff and landing. While 12,000 pounds of titanium, then considered an exotic metal, I would say it still is, in its structure, North American developed equipment and methods for forming titanium later used throughout the aviation industry. The ejection seats fully enclosed the pilot, allowing safe ejection at supersonic speeds. Tanks in the fuselage and in the wings carried a special fuel that helped with cooling the aircraft, so it acted as a heat sink. Back here we see those hinges. When folded down, the XB-70's wing tips added stability during high-speed flight. They also increased lift by helping contain the shock wave underneath the aircraft. Heat-resistant stainless steel honeycomb skin covered most of the plane. Strong lightweight insulated the fuel tanks from heat caused by air friction at high speed. Back here it talks about the elevons. Combined the functions of elevators for pitch or nose up, nose down control, and ailerons for banking the wings. So each one of these flaps moved independently. The plane had 6 YJ-93 afterburning engines, produced an impressive 28,800 pounds of thrust each. Supersonic air intake. Air was slowed down to subsonic speed as it traveled into the engines. So as North American aviation is building the Valkyrie, back in Washington, D.C., the doubts are growing. By the late 50s, the development of intercontinental ballistic missiles is changing the landscape of nuclear warfare. These missiles could reach targets across continents without risking air crews. They were less susceptible to interception. They were far cheaper than maintaining a fleet of these Mach 3 bombers. And Eisenhower saw the rising costs, and he questioned the need for the bombers when the ICBMs could do really the same job faster and cheaper. We need an adequate defense, but every arms dollar we spend above adequacy has a long-term weakening effect upon the nation and its security. These were his thoughts, and if you're familiar with Eisenhower, you realize this is going to go along with his general feelings about the military-industrial complex. At the Pentagon, the defense community is split over this plane's future. The Air Force and defense contractors were pushing forward, believing that the aircraft's unmatched speed and altitude were still essential for penetrating Soviet airspace. Again, thinking about the military-industrial complex here. And then you have Eisenhower and defense analysts seeing a different reality. Advancements in missile technology and Soviet air defenses are going to render the aircraft vulnerable and strategically redundant. So here's where it gets really political. You have Eisenhower now against the aircraft, and he takes decisive action regardless of what anybody else around him is saying. And let's be fair, if anybody in the Oval Office had their credentials to make that call, it was Eisenhower. This wasn't a politician guessing at military strategy from behind a desk or trying to play smoke and mirrors with the press and his voters. This was the Supreme Allied Commander of World War II. This guy oversaw Operation Overlord. The man led the largest invasion in history. So he knew a thing or two about military assets and how they could or couldn't win wars. He had a pretty decent instinct there. And so in November of '59, he cuts funding for the Valkyrie, and you go from the Air Force envisioning a couple hundred of these bombers to a single prototype for research purposes. And he redirects the military focus to ICBMs. He's prioritizing the development of the Atlas and Titan ICBMs, and he has the Strategic Air Command, once focused on the bombers like the B-52, begin transitioning to missile-based strategies. But again, not everybody's on board. You have the Air Force leadership and some members of Congress pushing back, still believing in the value of a Mach 3 bomber, especially congressmen whose states relied on the Valkyrie for jobs, and you can see why Eisenhower was concerned about the military-industrial complex once again, and he holds firm. But then comes the 1960 presidential election. Eisenhower has served his 8 years. Vice President Nixon is running to succeed him on the Republican ticket, facing off against a young senator from Massachusetts on the Democratic ticket. And Senator John F. Kennedy seizes on the Valkyrie. He argues against the defense cuts, specifically calling out this aircraft, accusing the Republicans of being soft on U.S. defense. So just 1 week before the election, October 30th, 1960, Eisenhower and Congress approve an additional $155 million for the B-70 program, the equivalent of over $1.5 billion today. It was a political move. Eisenhower had no intention of reversing course, but it happened anyway, and the Republicans still lost. But once the election rhetoric fades and Kennedy takes office, he starts receiving more intelligence on the subject, and suddenly his view shifts, and he realizes that Eisenhower was right. And Kennedy follows through on that trajectory, Eisenhower's trajectory, and he cancels the XB-70 project as a combat aircraft entirely. Instead, the program is officially repurposed as a research platform for high-speed flight testing, leading to the construction of just one more prototype for a total of 2 planes. Now we flash forward to 1964, 9 years after they first started designing this aircraft, and nearly a year after Kennedy was assassinated. The XB-70 finally takes its maiden flight. At this point, it's no longer a bomber. Its mission is now high-speed flight research with 2 planned prototypes. This one, the first prototype, and a second one, which would later be destroyed in a tragic accident. We'll get to that in a minute. What were they testing? So the goal was to push the boundaries of high-speed flight and study aerodynamic performance. So how does the aircraft handle at extreme speeds and altitudes? Structural integrity. Can its materials and construction withstand the intense heat and pressure of sustained Mach 3 flight? And sonic boom research. What are the effects of the shock waves? How can we better understand them? 2 months after its first flight, the XB-70 broke the sound barrier. By October of '65, it hit Mach 3, but on that flight, a piece of the left wing's leading edge tore away under the stress. And this was the second time that they had lost a section of the wing, and so after the incident, they kept this original plane at a max of Mach 2.5 and relied on the improved design of a second plane. In the summer of '65, just before this incident, the second prototype came out, and the following year, it finally achieved the program's ultimate goal of Mach 3 at 75,000 feet, maintaining that speed for 33 minutes, making it the fastest and longest sustained Mach 3 flight of the entire program. And in total, it made 9 flights, reaching Mach 3. 1 year after the second prototype had its maiden flight, the Air Force was conducting a promotional flight. This was, I believe, its 46th flight ever. This was a photo opportunity, a publicity shoot for General Electric aircraft engines. They had multiple military aircraft flying in formation over the desert near Barstow, California, and shortly after the photos were taken, an F-104 Starfighter was positioned just off the right wing of the XB-70. So I'm going to pause here just for a moment to show you this F-104 Starfighter, also here at the National Museum of the United States Air Force. This is the same type of airplane that collided in midair with the XB-70. And that, of course, led to the destruction of that second Valkyrie. Now, the airplane that crashed into the Valkyrie was a NASA variant of the F-104. It was a demilitarized version of it. NASA used those for high-speed test flights, and they used them to train astronauts, including those in the Apollo program. Lockheed dubbed this plane a missile with a man in it, and looking at it, you can see why with these razor-thin, stubby wings. This was one of the first fighters capable of Mach 2, set multiple speed and altitude records. It was designed as a high-speed interceptor. It was built to launch quickly, climb to extreme altitudes, take down enemy bombers. It was not meant for slow, stable flight like what it was attempting during the photo shoot that day. These aircraft were notoriously difficult to fly, and you can imagine how they might be unstable and unforgiving at times. They had a high accident rate. The West German Air Force operated 916 of them, and they lost 292 in accidents, resulting in 116 pilot fatalities, and the Germans called it the Widowmaker. Since the museum has this aircraft on display, I just wanted to take a moment and show it to you so we can get a better sense of what was flying next to the Valkyrie that day and the challenges that contributed to taking out both of these aircraft. So the F-104 was flying off the right wing of the bomber down here, and it encountered intense wake turbulence that was generated from this big massive delta wing, including wingtip vortices. So you have this swirling air back here, and one theory is that the F-104 got caught in that and it flipped it inverted, and it came up over the wing, came back across those vertical stabilizers and sheared them off, both of them, at their base. The Valkyrie continued to fly for several seconds, but with the loss of its control surfaces, it became uncontrollable, and it entered a spin and ultimately crashed. Inside the aircraft was pilot Al White. He was a North American aviation test pilot, as well as Carl Cross, and he was a U.S. Air Force test pilot serving as White's co-pilot. These aircraft were equipped with an ejection pod system that was designed to fully encapsulate each crew member in the event of a decompression or an ejection at high speed. And the system featured this clamshell-like canopy that would seal around the pilot before ejection. As the plane became uncontrollable, White activated that system, but his arm got caught. It got trapped in this clamshell as it was closing, and that caused a lot of injuries to his arm, and he couldn't eject until he got that freed. And even then, the clamshell never fully sealed, and that prevented an airbag underneath the pod from inflating, and that airbag was critical to soften the landing. So he hit the ground with tremendous G-force, and that caused a lot of internal trauma. He did survive, but he was in critical condition for some time. He did recover. Carl Cross, unfortunately, was unable to eject, and he did not survive. And so the crash claimed both his life and the F-104 pilot, Joe Walker. I ran across this clip of Al White talking about a bit about his experience. Al was incidentally the pilot who flew the XB-70 the most flights, so he was one of the most experienced of anybody who had flown it. He was the most experienced.
When the collision occurred, we lost the vertical stabilizers off the airplane. We didn't know we'd been hit. We knew somebody had been hit, but wasn't sure that it was us, and really it never occurred to me that it was. I heard noise, I heard a terrible explosion kind of thing, but didn't feel any, it didn't pulse the airplane, or didn't even seem to jar the airplane. But anyway, when I put the control in, it just took off, and there was nothing to stop it. And I hit full power on that side, but it actually yawed so far that it just virtually snapped. And of course they were yelling, bail out.
After the crash, they continued flying this plane, the original one, for about 3 more years. But it did have those structural concerns because of pieces of it falling off earlier, and they did have it reduced down to no more than Mach 2.5. And its role shifted primarily to high-speed flight research in collaboration with NASA. In total, between the 2 prototypes that were built, 129 flights were conducted. This aircraft accounted for 83 of those flights, and it logged 160 hours and 16 minutes of total flight time. Keep in mind that the second prototype was less than a year old when it crashed. On February 4th, 1969, this aircraft took its final flight, which was a one-way trip here to the National Museum of the United States Air Force, Dayton, Ohio. It was the only time that the XB-70 ever landed anywhere other than Edwards Air Force Base, and once here, it went on display. Now, I remember seeing this aircraft here when I was a kid, and at some point, I think it was when the 3rd building opened, they rearranged the layout of the museum, and they didn't really have a place for it. So they put it in an auxiliary hangar until this 4th building was built. This building has the experimental aircraft, the space program artifacts, The Presidential Aircraft Collection, which I have done multiple videos on, that's on the opposite end of this hangar. When you walk into this building, it's breathtaking. As soon as you step in, right off to the right here, you see this massive, sleek, futuristic looking aircraft. It's unlike anything else. It's just a sight to behold. So if you're ever in the Dayton area, it's going to need to be on your short list of aircraft to see here at this museum. Thanks for watching. I'll see you down the road.